you all. Thank you all for attending today's RDA webinar on Metadata Standards Directory. First of all, I would like to inform you that we will record this webinar and make it available online via the RDA webpage and via YouTube. Your questions and discussions will not be published, so you will stay completely anonymous. Now let me present you our speaker. Alex Ball is the Research Data Librarian at the University of Bath, where he provides advice and guidance to researchers on managing their data. Before that, he was a member of the UK Digital Curation Centre, where he maintained the disciplinary metadata and research data tools, catalogs, and wrote guidance on data management topics. He is a co-moderator of the Dublin Core Service and Metadata Community and was Metadata Coordinator of the UK Research Data Discovery Service project. Alex, please go ahead.
Hi there. Yes. So in the course of this presentation, I'd like to go through the motivation for the work of the Metadata Standards Directory Working Group. Just give you an overview of what other initiatives are already out there looking at the same kind of issues. Then I'd like to go over the working group itself and go through all the things that we managed to achieve during our 18 months and to tell you a little bit about where we're going to be taking this work forward. But to begin with then with the motivation, the motivation for our group comes from a firm belief that metadata standards are a good thing. I don't expect that's too contentious an opinion amongst RDA folk, but it takes an investment of time and effort to create standardized metadata. So for some it might fall under the ideally if I have time part of their to-do list. If they were to ask why should I use a metadata standard, the answer would be fundamentally about interoperability, but that's something only those of us on the infrastructure side of things really care about. What they want to know is what the interoperation of metadata-powered systems can do for them. For one thing, it makes discovering existing data easier. If lots of data sets use a common metadata standard, you can build catalogs that search across that information in useful ways. If many catalogs use a common standard, you can build aggregators that mean you can run the same search over all of them at once. Second of all, it means putting the data in context is easier. If lots of different entities are documented in a reliable way, you can build systems for traversing the relationships between them, instead of having to look things up in different ways over and over again. And the more entities that are documented in a common way, the more comprehensive a network you can provide. Third, if a dataset is documented in a reliable way, it saves the next person a lot of time and effort coming to understand the data, meaning they can verify, build on, and integrate the data without having to do a lot of detective work first. Quite apart from systems interoperability, there are a number of side benefits that accrue from people concentrating on a single standard for a single purpose. If people have a standard to work from, they don't have to work everything out from scratch each time, which means they are less likely to miss out on useful information. And after using the same standard a number of times, by dint of the practice, they get better and quicker at it. When many people are using the standard, they can help each other when they get stuck by answering questions and sharing notes, and over time this coalesces into better documentation. Common problems are easier to identify, and if a lot of people care about it, it is easier to get the effort together to fix it. When you have a critical mass of people who would benefit from it, you begin to see tools emerge that take away some of the pain of creating the metadata, and so on and so forth. So if metadata standards are so great, that leads us to the obvious question, why doesn't everyone use a metadata standard? So at this point I'd like to ask you to take to your keyboards and just give me some suggestions as to why you think people might not use a metadata standard. Yes, I think we've got a really good list of answers there. Yes, they might not know how to do it. It might not exactly match the use case that they're after. They're confused about which one to use. There might be too many of them. They don't see what the benefits are. There's a lot of effort. What are the rewards? And it can be difficult to enrich a document or a resource. Well, there's lots of really good suggestions there, and I've chose 3 things to talk about. Label there 1, 2, 3, and I'm glad to see we agree on all of them. For a start, someone might not use a standard because they don't know of any that are suitable in their field of research. On the slide there is a statistic from a study published in 2011 showing that out of a sample of 1,200 scientists, over 78% of respondents used either no metadata at all or they used some homegrown metadata solution. The authors of the study blamed that on a lack of training. Researchers either didn't know or didn't care about metadata standards, and that points to a need for a resource for discovering relevant standards. Somebody did mention too many standards. Well, that is another possibility. If there are too many standards, it gives rise to a massive duplication of effort and a dilution of the effort available to go into tools, documentation, training, and future development of the standards themselves. We can blame some of this on broken communities and inflexible specifications, but I think some of this duplication is down to ignorance. Ignorance of the standards that are already out there being used, and ignorance of the profiling techniques that exist for adapting common standards for local needs. And another one is, it's not always quite as simple as just use this standard. If you just give someone an XML specification and tell them to get on with it, it's not going to win friends and influence people, is it? At the very least, you want to be able to give them a stack of examples they can adapt, but ideally you want to be able to hide all of that complexity away behind a simple web form with half of the fields already filled in with the right values. And it would be nice to be able to give them a phone number of someone they can call if they get stuck. The point is that it's not just the standards themselves that are important, but also the ecosystem that has grown up around them. So we've established that there's a need for some sort of discovery service out there for metadata standards and the tools and agencies that support them. So what has been done to fill that need? Well, there have been several reports published. The Science Data Literacy Project published a list of metadata standards relevant for research in 2008. I wrote a scoping study for JISC in 2009 that was looking at the feasibility of a generic scientific data application profile for UK institutional repositories. So in that report I looked at the metadata standards that were being used by subject-specific data centers and institutional data repositories that were in operation at the time. Following year, in 2010, Riley and Becker produced a visualization of the community domain function and purpose of 105 metadata standards that were of relevance to the cultural heritage sector. Now, these are all great resources, but they're static. They aren't being updated or expanded. They also don't address the ecosystem question very well. What's really needed are dynamic directories that keep up to date and get fixed when gaps are identified. Happily, there are some of those around as well. Biosharing is a directory of databases, standards and policies relevant to the life sciences. These include not only what I'd call metadata standards, but also vocabularies and file formats. And the search facilities there are very well matched to the target community. The Marine Metadata Interoperability Project maintains a directory of content standard references applicable to marine science. In this context, content standard, they mean a list or hierarchy of metadata elements making up a metadata record. So that is the kind of thing that I would mean by a metadata standard. GEOS, the group on Earth observation systems of systems, has to think very hard about interoperability, as the whole point of it is to link together a large number of autonomous systems. So to help them, they maintain a registry of the standards they support or would consider supporting. There are quite a few metadata standards in there, as well as technical protocols and file formats. EarthCube, the cyber infrastructure initiative for the geosciences, maintains Synergy, the community inventory of EarthCube resources for geosciences interoperability. This again is a diverse collection of resources, including many metadata standards. I apologize for not being able to get a very good screenshot of it, but it wasn't working at the point at which I was compiling these slides. These are again all great resources, but they're specific to particular communities. If you don't happen to fall into one of these groups, or if you're working between or across disciplines, you might get a bit stuck. Incidentally, if you do know of any other discipline-specific lists of metadata standards, we would love to know about them, so feel free to add them into the chat box. So we identified a gap for a directory that could be used by any researcher, that could be kept current and comprehensive by the community, and it was to fill that gap that we formed the Metadata Standards Directory Working Group. The purpose of the group was to develop this metadata standards directory, listing standards relevant for research data that would be comprehensive, meaning it would be covering all disciplines and most generic applications, and easy for anyone to contribute to or update. The group also decided to define and develop use cases for research metadata to help with organizing standards within the directory, and to develop a plan for the long-term growth and maintenance of the directory. We could see that many different stakeholders would have an interest in the directory, researchers, research support staff, repositories, funders. In fact, most of the Research Data Alliance's growing community. We engaged them in various ways. Back in 2013, we held a Camp for Data at the Dublin Core Conference in Lisbon. This event attracted 26 participants from 15 countries, covered a range of scientific metadata issues, from infrastructure models and frameworks through to usage and tracking of metadata, to common fields to associate with persistent IDs. I gave a presentation at the International Digital Curation Conference on the work of the working group in 2014 in San Francisco, and at about the same time my colleague Jane Greenberg presented our work at the RDA EU Working Group Core meeting in Garching in Munich. We also made use of our working group mailing list, which is accessible from the RDA website, and at the last count that put us in touch with 140 RDA members. But before I get around to talking about the directory we developed, there is one more resource I should tell you about, and that is the Disciplinary Metadata Catalog developed by the UK Digital Curation Centre. This was launched in January 2013 at about the same time that the working group was being planned. It was conceived as a resource that institutional data curators could consult when advising researchers on how they should document their data. The thinking was that such curators would first want to know what standards are in use within the discipline in question, and if there were none or very few, they might want to know about broader standards that could be adapted. For any given standard, they might be interested in specification for the standard, any vocabularies or taxonomies that are commonly used in conjunction with the standard, any profiles that tailor the standard to a particular application context, any tools that are available for working with the standard, any examples of the standard being used by repositories or data portals, as these might be useful as sources of practical advice on how to use the standard and also indicate the level of adoption among researchers in the area. It was almost exactly the kind of thing the working group was looking for. Almost, but not quite. But on the same principle as before, that it's better to develop and improve what's already there than to start from scratch again, the working group and the DCC entered into collaboration to use this catalogue as the starting point for the Metadata Standards Directory. So the specific issues that we wanted to address were the UK selection bias. It had been compiled with the UK audience in mind, so there were certain profiles and standards specific to other countries that had been missed out. And it was incomplete for another reason, because it had been compiled mainly by Liz Bedford and myself, and we couldn't claim deep knowledge of every discipline, so there were some standards we had missed. So to address those issues, the working group decided to conduct a worldwide survey of researchers to fill in the gaps. But that wasn't all. The process for maintaining the catalogue was slow and opaque, which, if anybody wanted to add in a change, the process that we had in place was that they would email the DCC help desk. The help desk would pass it on to me, and I would make the change when I had time. And because the catalogue was just another set of pages on the DCC website, it wasn't all that simple to bring in help from outside due to the security implications for the site. For the same reason, there was little scope for future development. We could only do what Drupal allowed us to do, and only if it would not compromise the rest of the site. So, with an eye on the longer term, we planned to migrate the service and content to a new platform that would make it easier and more transparent for anyone to contribute to it, that would support a larger team of volunteer editors and give us more scope for future development. So, the survey that was performed by two students, Sean Chen and Christina Perez, within the School of Information and Library Science at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, under the supervision of the chairs of the working group and with technical assistance from the DCC. Following an initial pilot, the survey was circulated to stakeholder mailing lists around the globe in October 2013. We had intended to keep it open for only 2 weeks, but unfortunately the US government was shut down for most of that time, so we agreed to keep the survey running as our primary way of collecting contributions until we could set up a better solution. Our last contribution via the form was in April 2014, and in that time we'd received a total of 41 responses, giving us 50 new entries and 18 updates for the DCC catalogue. The next task was, of course, to migrate the content to the new platform. So in early 2014, Sean Chen set up a prototype for us on GitHub Pages that mirrored the DCC data structures, but was generated from a set of, well, really quite simple text files. I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment. It was polished further by Kate Aldrete, our Data One intern, between May and August 2014, and finally made production ready by Adrian Ogletree, Dustin Allen, Sean and myself between January and February 2015, and we launched it at the RDA 5th plenary. The Metadata Standards Directory has a 6-element data model. The records for the metadata standards themselves are the most detailed, of course, but there are also much simpler records for profiles of those standards, tools for working with them, and examples of repositories and services that use them. All of these records are classified by the broad subject area and the specific disciplines to which they relate. We also have special classifications for general and discipline agnostic standards. So let me show you what a record for a metadata standard looks like. At the top we have the name and a short description that tells you what the standard is used for. We then have a summary table with additional information, such as a link to the standard's homepage, a direct link to its specification document, links to vocabularies commonly used with the standard, lists of known mappings to other standards, and so on. The last two parts of the summary show how the standard has been classified according to its relevance to the broad subject areas and specific disciplines. And you can click on the names to look up what other standards have been classified with the same terms. Below that are lists of profiles or extensions, tools and use cases that have been tagged as relevant to this standard. You'll notice there are little buttons marked Edit and Add. These take you through to the GitHub online text editor, where you can respectively edit the entry that you see or add a new one. So let me show you what the source for this page looks like. As you can see, it is about as simple as you can get. It's in a format called YAML, which is a recursive acronym for YAML 8 markup language. Whether that name is accurate is debatable, but the syntax is clear. You have a key, and a colon and a space, and then a value, with some extra notation for multiple values and for hierarchies. This means it can be passed easily by software as well as by humans. We provide templates with all the keys we use, and where we use controlled values, these relate to file names within the system. You can browse through the directory in several different ways. We have an index that lists the names and descriptions of all the standards, arranged by broad subject area. The names link through to the record pages. There are similar indexes for profiles, tools, and use cases, but for those entries, the names link through directly to their home pages rather than to a local record. That might change if we get a demand for more detailed entries for them. Alternatively, you can view a page for a subject area or discipline and see all the entries that relate to it. On the slide is the page for archaeology, and you can see it has the 4 different lists. All those pages are accessible from our index of disciplines, which is again subdivided by broad subject area. If you do contribute via the GitHub editor or indeed your own local copy, the edits won't go in directly. They'll come to our team of volunteer editors as a pull request. This just gives us a chance to do some quality control and weed out any spam if anybody is likely to give us any. But we just to emphasize that we do welcome contributions, and the edits do tend to go in very, very quickly. Another way you can help us is to tell us about it. Another way that you can tell us about a standard is via the issue tracker. It's very quick, it's very easy to do, so if you don't feel up to adding a full entry yourself, you can at least put it on our to-do list so it doesn't get forgotten. To date, there have been 25 updates or additions suggested through the issue tracker and 21 contributed through the pull request mechanism. That gives you some idea of how well it's being developed, and you can also see that in the commit history for the source code at the top of that slide. How well is it being used? I'm afraid I don't have usage figures for the metadata standards directory version on the GitHub site, but I can give you an impression of the usefulness of the resource by how it's being used on the DCC website. In 2015, the DCC version received 27,355 visits, which accounted for 6% of the traffic to the DCC website. That doesn't sound like much when I say it like that. So to give you a sense of what that actually means, that makes it the third most popular section of the site after the section on events and the one on how-to guides. So I think that's a good start and it's really encouraging, but I'm sure we can do better than that. There are still lots of ways we could develop it further to make it even more useful to people. Back in the at the RDA third plenary, the one that was in Dublin, we had a brainstorming session and thought up a large number of possible ways in which different stakeholders might use the directory. Many of them were too ambitious for what we were able to achieve in our 18-month time frame, but we did keep them in mind as we developed the GitHub prototype, and now we're in a position to consider developing a much more capable catalog. So on these next few slides I'll show you some of the use cases that came out of that meeting. We had a group of people who were representing data providers and custodians, and they came up with quite a lot of ideas. This is just a selection. One was to search or browse for metadata standards by what they describe, not only by the specific type of tabular data, but also whether there were standards relating to physical artifacts or video, things like that. They thought it might be useful to compare standards side by side, especially to identify the common features between standards of different communities. And I can see that also being useful if you're wanting to construct a crosswalk or a common interface across several different standards. Another use was to obtain recommendations of standards based on a set of criteria. Beyond the disciplinary aspect we already have, one can imagine using something like the number of use cases that are associated with a standard or associations with a standards body. They also would like to be able to look up a persistent identifier for a standard to enable robust linking to it. I think persistent identifiers were on people's mind a lot that day, as you'll see a bit later on. The group representing librarians, most of them we could actually accommodate within the directory that we developed, but to give you a flavour of the kinds of things they came up with, one was to inspect existing profiles of a standard as a first step to constructing a new one. And as I say, we're able to do that by having the profiles that are associated with each standard right there in the directory. Someone representing journal editors said they would like to use the directory to check the maturity and level of support of existing standards so they know which ones they ought to recommend to authors. We can infer that now from our list of tools and use cases as to how well standards are being used, but it might be useful for us to present things slightly differently in order to make that calculation a bit easier and clearer to make. A representative of a funder said they would like to use the directory to find out which standards the funder have paid for the development of, whether they're widely used, whether they've been kept up to date, and whether they might be better off merging into other standards. I mean, there are overlaps there with some of the other use cases we've already looked at, but that's talking about things like additional search criteria, measurements of maturity, and being able to compare across standards. But our biggest list came from tool developers. One of the things they would like is to be able to submit a whole or partial data set and from that retrieve a list of metadata standards which could be used to document it. For that we need something like a Jove or Droid-like format identifier and quite detailed knowledge of what data types the standards are intended to support. Or to generate a first attempt crosswalk between schemas automatically, which is taking that idea of being able to compare across different metadata standards to its ultimate conclusion. Another suggestion was being able to submit a set of field names to the directory and retrieve the metadata standard from which they originate. Again, this is a kind of format identification problem that we'd have to invent a routine to solve. Another suggestion was to request from the directory a sample of metadata records that adhered to a specific standard. So in order to support that use case, that would mean assembling sample groups of records associated with each metadata standard. The next one, to retrieve a list of appropriate metadata standards based on partial content from a draft data management plan. This one's actually rocketed quite a bit up our list of priorities because we will actually be looking at this in an RDA Europe collaboration project, again with the DCC, who also developed the DMP online tool. Another suggestion, here we go back to the persistent identifier idea, but then submitting the identifier for a standard to the directory in order to receive back the specification. I think that the group had it in mind that we would record persistent identifiers where they already existed, but for those without, maybe we could mint our own. And lastly, there to be able to submit a pair of identifiers for metadata standards to the directory and get back a suggested migration pathway. So we do, as I've said already, collect information on crosswalks that we know about, so that would be a great use for that information. So that list might have sparked your imagination about the possibilities of this directory. So again, I'd like to pause for a moment and ask if you can think of any other uses to which a metadata standards directory or catalogue might be put. So we'll have a couple of minutes for you to hopefully make some suggestions for us. Yeah, finding which standards are most relevant for their community. So that's looking at quite a detailed level at the uses for which a particular standard is intended. Yes, the discipline neutral schemas. As I hinted at earlier, we do collect some standards that are more generic. So we have things in there like Serif and Dublin Core and OAI, ORE, things that are generally useful and can be adapted for local needs quite generally across research data applications. Ah, yes, which resources and tools are compatible with which standard? Yes. Yes, so when we do have tools for working with particular standards, we do try and associate those with particular standards, so they do show up when people are looking at the record for a standard. They can also see all the tools that work with them. Might be a bit contentious if we start making value judgments as to how well they support those standards. Well, thank you very much for those. Let's. I've only got a couple of slides left, so I just want to move on to say that the current directory is a great base to build on, but there's a lot more work to do. So we can only hope to satisfy these kinds of use cases that came up in our brainstorming session in Dublin and just now, with more detail about the specific standards and profiles in our database. So what other things might we need that we don't have already? Some of these use cases require information at the element level. So we've got a choice there. Do we try and keep that information, the specifications, in the native form? We already provide links, but do we want to start providing a repository of these specifications and serving them from our own servers? Do we keep the specifications in a normalized form? Should we provide converters in a normalized form? As I say, we provide links to converters and tools and crosswalks already, but this is about storing and serving some ready-to-use code. Do we develop a classification of data types for which standards are used? Do we add flags that mark whether a standard is tied to a given format or whether it's RDA friendly and thus able to be used in linked open data applications? We're certainly going to need an API for automated access to the information and structured outputs so that the tools that are querying it can act on the information they receive back. Also, we want to make it even easier for people to contribute, whether that's directly or via automated tools in other systems. So to that end, we are starting a new working group called the Metadata Standards Catalog Working Group. The move from directory to catalog is meant to signify that extra level of sophistication that will allow software to interrogate the resource and act on what it receives back. The new group was recognized and endorsed a month ago on the 18th of January, and we've agreed a work plan as follows. By the middle of July this year, we want to be able to, well, we want to have collected and analyzed use cases to produce the requirements and technical specification for our catalog. By this time next year, we will have developed a prototype catalog and identified a set of adopters for it. And then by mid-July 2017, we'll evaluate and validate the catalog, add mappings from a selection of standards to functional packages, and refine the user interface and API to make sure it's maximally useful. Now, that bit about functional packages, I really ought to explain that because I know it's not obvious. The idea is similar to that of the Kazride dictionary, or perhaps the inner workings of Pandoc, if you're familiar with that particular conversion utility. The idea is that the package would set out the metadata that's needed for a particular function in a standard neutral kind of way. And then by mapping from each standard to that package, we can use that to match up elements that are doing roughly the same job in different standards, and then use that as a basis for generating a rough and ready to converter to go between them. So that the package itself wouldn't be a rival standard or application profile, it would simply act as a way of simplifying translations between standards. The idea is to try and reduce the complexity from being an n-squared problem where you're trying to map from everything to everything else to a scale of n where you're all just mapping to the same thing and to get information in and out. So as I say, the new working group is only a month old, so we would love it if you would join us. You can find our page on the RDA website at that URL. So all that really remains for me to do is to acknowledge the many contributors to the work so far. In particular, I'd like to thank my fellow co-chairs of the Metadata Standards Directory Working Group, Jane, Keith and Rebecca, and to acknowledge the people who put in the majority of the hard work on the ground. So Liz, who developed the original Disciplinary Metadata Catalog for the DCC, and for Sean, Christina, Kate, Adrian, who worked so hard on developing our GitHub instance and providing the updates and new entries for our catalogue and our data. I'd also like to thank our working group members who suggested directory entries, provided use cases and helped to steer the work. And thank you all for listening.